Mr. Connor, Dr. Marshall, Mr. Khayyam, and so very many friends in this audience. Thank you very much, Mr. Connor, for that splendid introduction. It always sounds much more formidable than I am, because I'm really just an Englishwoman, but an Englishwoman of the kind who many years earlier could have come over with the Pilgrim Fathers to build the greatest nation on earth. It's a great honor to be here to talk with those who belong to the James Madison Institute. I too admire tremendously the great personalities, the great men who are present at your founding. One is never quite sure whether it was the personalities that led to the independence or whether it was the idea of independence that brought forth the personalities. In any case, there was a collection of people at that time of integrity, of ability, of principle, of power of communication, the like of which the world has never seen. And as I go through the list, George Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, they were among the giants of the world. I have been asked to speak about the moral foundations of liberty and democracy. You may think it's rather heavy for after dinner, but may I say this to you: we don't talk about it enough. And sometimes our political opponents who hold a totally different creed tend to get away with suggesting that they have more morality than we do. That is not the case. So may I fulfill my instructions as a lawyer and start to talk about and prove the moral foundations of liberty and democracy. They began here with the Pilgrim Fathers, those who came over because they did not have freedom of worship in their own particular faith in my country at that time. They felt so strongly that they wanted to worship in their own way that they came across to this very great country. They came with the biblical ethics. This is very important. There are many religions in the world, but there are only 3 that are founded on the biblical ethics, founded on the Old Testament Judaism, founded on the New Testament Christianity, accepting both with Christ as a prophet, comes Islam with Muhammad as the last prophet. Those are the 3 founded on the biblical ethics. Why is that so important? Because perhaps the biblical ethics are the only ones where the message is addressed to each individual, not to collective groups, not to purposes, but to each individual. The Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, are addressed to each individual. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God, and then the instructions: thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's ox, his neighbor, and so on, addressed to each individual. The law of Moses, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, coming in the New Testament. So there we are. We have, thou shalt worship the God. We have, you shall, each individual do what he must do. You have, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And there you have the total creed. It comes in no other religion in quite the same way. They came over with that creed, the Pilgrim Fathers. And It was very interesting if you look back at some of the history. We have a historian at my table. I'm really quite shy in telling you American history, but you know, I as an Englishwoman know a lot more about it than some Americans. What did the famous John Winthrop say on the deck of a small ship, the Arabella, that was coming over? And he called the people together to see that they understood the great adventure, the great mission, more than adventure, upon which they had embarked. And he said this: "We shall be as a city on a hill. The eyes of all the people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout all the world." It was a remarkable beginning. Indeed, if you try to trace things back in history, the beginning with the Pilgrim Fathers, the beginning with the message I've indicated, look after thy neighbor as thyself, which was them a necessity, is the beginning of why America today has more voluntary action than any other country in the world. It started from that time. They had to look after their neighbor. And so you'll find that as people have prospered in your country and in mine, but even more in your country, as they have prospered, so they regard it as their duty to prosper and help others. And indeed, in 1992, which is the latest year for which figures are available, you, my friends, gave $124 billion to voluntary purposes. What a marvelous record. It was always said, of course, that it was not only the biblical message, but if you like to look back to ancient times, to the philosophers of Rome, to the great philosophers of Greece, to Plato, to Aristotle, to Socrates, they also had a message about truth and goodness and honor and integrity and duty. They most certainly did. But the question arises whether reason and argument and a philosophy not based on faith is good enough. In the reality, it turned out not to be so. The account is given by Sir Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall, and wrote not only of Rome but also of Athens. And it was interesting, he had this to say. In the end, saying this about the Athenians, perhaps the oldest example of democracy. In the end, more than they wanted freedom, they wanted security. They wanted a comfortable life, and they lost it all. Security, comfort, and freedom. And this is the punch line, as we would say. When the Athenians finally wanted not to give to society, but for society to give to them, when the freedom they wished for most was freedom from responsibility, then Athens ceased to be free. There you have the germ of the dependency culture. Freedom from responsibility. To us, all the fundamental liberties which we've come to know, which were enshrined in your Declaration of Independence. It's very interesting. I don't know how much you look at it. I'm not sure that history is taught so well in our schools. Drafted, of course, by Jefferson, a brilliant draftsman, and it was not his first draft. He had to work hard at the draft. It was like some of those legal drafts that we do, and it had a magic about it. There are certain unalienable, not inalienable, but unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to preserve which governments are instituted among men. Unalienable rights. Didn't matter how the majority voted later in democracy. There are certain things, human rights, unalienable rights, that you cannot upset. They belong to everyone by virtue of being human. And so, one looked at this remarkable Declaration of Independence and the things which were later built upon it. To us now, these fundamental liberties are second nature. And they were communicated in those days in some of the greatest speeches of the English languages, of the whole English language. We have learned to know the habits of freedom. They are embodied in the institutions, in the common law, and eventually law made by Parliament or law made by your Congress. My friends, do you understand how fortunate we are to have a rule of law? Without this, we could not be free. You've got the whole history. You came for liberty. Liberty, unless ordered by a rule of law, would be liberty for the strong to oppress the weak. How did the rule of law develop? I am quite fearful of telling you, but you got it from us. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. In the early days when you were with us, or your ancestors were with us, the King's Council, the King would say to members of his council, there is a quarrel, a difference, they petition me to sort it out, and he delegated the wisest of his counselors to go and hear a case. They, in something in the character of your ancestors and mine, decided things on the basis of fairness and equity. Equity is a great principle which belongs to you and belongs to fairness and equity. Their decisions were written down. They became the common law of the land. Other people followed them. They were the decisions of the greatest and the wisest of people. Eventually, as parliaments were founded in 1265 and they began to pass some laws, then the decisions on those laws were made by an independent judiciary of great people. All this came to you at the Declaration of Independence. And there were many, many years when we had a rule of law and would have described ourselves as a free people, long before a universal franchise. Universal franchise only came in 1928. We went into World War I with only 30% of the men having the vote, because it was based on property, either property that you owned or paid rent for. That was an outward and visible sign of responsibility. And 1918, the vote to all men and some women. But we would have called ourselves a free people long before that, because some people had a franchise, but because we had a rule of law. And so our habits and customs have become embodied in the rule of law, courts of justice, an independent judiciary, Parliament and Congress, and later full democracy. These are cornerstones of liberty. They are a birthright, not of a class, but of every citizen of our nation and of your nation as a whole. How, my friends, then could it happen that this marvelous moral, religious foundation of liberty and our country and democracy and the rule of law, how then could it happen that we in fact played about with socialism and that it took hold, as it did in my country? Fortunately, it is not in yours, although I do notice a tendency. If there's a problem, there are certain people who always say, this is a problem, we need a new government grant. Don't go that way. It all adds up to very much higher taxation. Socialism is a creed where some people tend to think that income belongs to the state, and the duty of the state is to decide how much the people should be allowed to retain. It is a state where egalitarian measures pull down what is above, but never raise what is below. It is a place where you get high taxation, nationalization of major industries, high regulation, all came to Britain in the post-war period from 1945 to 51, then again from 64 to 70. We were fortunate in having a few people who would not tolerate this. I'm afraid some of our members of Parliament were talking about a mixed economy. Always beware of a mixed economy. The tendency is they can call it a mixed economy when it gets more and more socialist and less free. And so, some of our very great people, remember Sir Anthony Fisher, started up in Britain the Institute of Economic Affairs. Sir Keith Joseph was a member of Parliament, and we served together in many cabinets, also started up the Centre of Policy Studies. Our purpose to renew the principles of our country, the principles of liberty, the principles of law, and the principles of democracy. It was very interesting, that very great commentator, Hayek, whom you all know, when he'd seen socialism taking hold in Britain and elsewhere, suddenly burst upon the world with a marvelous book, The Road to Serfdom. He got it in one. The Road to Serfdom. Later, a book called The Constitution of Liberty. Later, the books called Law, Legislation, and Liberty. He was a Nobel Prize winner. I met him. From time to time, I consulted him. He saw the state taking over more and more duties. He saw more and more regulations. He saw higher and higher taxation. Indeed, actually, when I eventually took over Britain, as you said, the top rate of tax on earned income was 83%, and the top rate of tax on savings income, which you'd have thought was a good thing to have and to encourage, was 98%. Hayek wrote this, perceptive man as he was. How sharp a break with the whole evolution of Western civilization the modern trend towards socialism means becomes clear if we consider it not merely against the background of the 19th century, but in a longer historical perspective. He went on. We are rapidly abandoning not the views merely of Cobden and Bright, the views of Adam Smith and Hume, or even of Locke and Milton, but one of the salient characteristics of Western civilization as it has grown from the foundations laid by Christianity and the Greeks and the Romans. Not merely 19th and 18th century liberalism, but the basic individualism inherited by us from Cicero, Tacitus, Pericles, and Thucydides is being progressively relinquished. There you are, in this great commentator. We were relinquishing the traditions we had gained from the biblical values and from the best in Greek civilization. It was a very interesting time. It took us a long time to get back into power and to do what we wished. But we just have to ask ourselves, my friends, how with a fantastic history, a wonderful tradition, what made people vote socialist in 1955 and again in 1964? I think myself there are three reasons. The first comes from the fact that some intellectuals played about with Marxism. Now, Karl Marx wrote his thesis, I regret to say, in the British Museum. He wrote about the freedom. He wrote about the freedom he had in the British Museum. but the creed he wrote about extinguished the very freedom that enabled him to write about it. The freedom of the British Museum. He wrote about a creed which denied, but when it came about as Lenin seized power in 1917 from the only election Russia had ever had, seized power from a man called Kerensky who won, and imposed the creed of Marxism. What was it? Denial of religious freedom, denial of freedom of speech, denial of freedom of association, denial of ownership of private property, denial of economic initiative, denial of everything that a human being wishes to do or wishes to offer. These few people, these arrogant intellectuals, and intellectuals can be very dangerous if they're only intellectuals. It's what you've got with, it's the values and virtues you possess alongside your intellectual capacity which make the difference, and the difference which has meant so much to our lives. This creed took a hold. It was attractive to some intellectuals. There are few people could take away the liberties from everyone. They could plan everything, and that would produce more prosperity than ever before. Now, this idea of planning everything appealed to some people. One of your journalists went over to Russia after 2 years of this plan had been in effect. And he came back, and your fellow journalist said to him, "Now, tell us, what's it like?" He said, "I've seen the future, and it works." Now, that was someone who was totally taken in by it. Many others were taken in by it, but gradually the awfulness of it came out. It's as if from that time in 1917, the whole world had entered into a great experiment on a scale unknown ever before between our way of life, the life of liberty, law, democracy, and the way of life of total communist tyranny, and they wanted to expand it the world over. Well, for 73 years, that experiment ran alongside one another, and in the end, it was the communist rule which totally and utterly collapsed. It was perhaps the Pope who got the reasoning right. The Pope John Paul II, said in his Centesimus Annus, it was about 3 years ago, he reminded us that the collapse of communism could not be considered simply as a technical problem. Rather, it was the violation of human rights, the human right to private initiative, the human right to ownership of property, and the right to economic freedom. In other words, it was not just that communism made mistakes, the whole system was fundamentally wrong. And so when the Iron Curtain came crashing down, an evil empire of lives and injustice, dogma and propaganda fell too. The power of truth, the power of truthful ideas that are in tune with the essential dignity of man, only they can prevail across the years. The ruins of Marxism testify most eloquently to that. Now, this was one of the things which some people had played with, to say, well, let's have a look at it, let's try. And in my time, many of the times, I've answered questions in the House of Commons to people sitting opposite me who were regularly going to Moscow and who regularly were playing to have more socialism, more public expenditure, more taxation. But when it came and finally collapsed, they were shown to be utterly wrong. It was, in addition to that, there was another reason why people played with socialism. It was a Great Depression of the 30s. Now, it was worse for you than it was for us. You had a terrible time in the 30s. Eventually, Roosevelt was in charge during that time. Conservative government was in charge in Britain. But those who went to war remembered the unemployment we had, remembered the difficulties we'd gone through, and in our country blamed it on the Conservative government. In fact, it was, I believe, the mismanagement of the money supply. We didn't understand a great deal about it at that time. At the time when they should have increased the money supply, they decreased it, and so the unemployment rose. But it had nothing to do with the economics of private enterprise or a free society. It was, in fact, mismanagement of government. But one of the reasons why people turned away from us was because of that very difficult time. And the other reason why they played with socialism was because during wartime, you have in fact to submit your own ambitions to the objective of the state and the objective of every person to win the battle against tyranny. Therefore, you do have to have much more central planning and control than you've ever had before. You have to submit to rationing, because the important thing is to release enough resources to support your armed men to defeat the tyrant, to defeat Hitler, then in the Far East to defeat Japan. And so you got a planned economy, rationing, regulation, central planning and control, and a certain number of people who would say, well, if it would work then, perhaps it would work now. It wouldn't, of course, because the moment the war is at an end, then you have obviously to resume your own ambitions to do better for your own family, to build them a much better future. There will also be the questions of the moral foundation of democracy. Now, it's very interesting. Democracy is about the will of the majority, but of course, that is always subject to human rights. It's interesting. Democracy is never mentioned in the Bible. When people are gathered together, whether as families, communities, or nations, their purpose is not to ascertain the will of the majority, but the will of the Holy Spirit. Nevertheless, I'm an enthusiast about democracy, because it is about more than the will of the majority, as I've indicated. It is essential to preserving freedom. As a famous Lord Acton reminded us, all power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So if no individual can be trusted with power indefinitely, it's even more true that no government can be. It has to be checked, and the best way of doing so is through the will of the majority, bearing in mind this can never be a substitute for individual human rights. I'm often asked, my friends, whether there will be a single international democracy, some new world order. No. There never will be. The United Nations has its purposes. It discusses the interesting, it discusses the difficulties of the time. It in fact passes resolution. It condemns aggression. It condemns it very strongly. But it's not the United Nations that takes action. You saw what a mess was made of Bosnia. Why? I will tell you. Because in Europe they sought consensus. They called together all of the foreign ministers of all the European countries and they reached consensus. My friends, there's not a shred of principle in consensus. What was the consensus? That we don't get involved. And the people of Bosnia suffered. It was a clear case, It had been accepted by the United Nations as a separate nation. Every nation has the right of self-defense, and therefore every nation has the right to obtain weapons to enable it to defend itself against the Serbian aggressor. That right was denied by a motion of the Security Council. Why the United States and we didn't veto it is a mystery to me. I know exactly what some of them said. Oh, there are a lot of weapons there. If you put any more there, it'll only prolong the fighting. That was the equivalent of saying the aggressor must succeed against the victim. I'm only too thankful that when Winston Churchill said to Roosevelt, in the early stages of the war, when we were standing absolutely alone, when he said to Roosevelt, "Give us the tools and we'll finish the job," Roosevelt didn't say, "Oh, there are plenty of weapons there. If we give you any, it'll only prolong the fighting." So, in fact, Bosnia has suffered dreadfully. In the end, it was Croatia, the first country to suffer, the first country to have been attacked by Serbia. It was Croatia who built up an effective armed force, who went into Bosnia, who began to retake the towns that had been taken by the Serbs and began to beat the aggressor. Only then did you get the Dayton Accord. And it is an object lesson. Always keep your defenses strong against an aggressor, but never again deny the means. My friends, in some respects, it has been a very difficult century. Who would have predicted at the beginning of it that we would have 2 world wars, that we would have a new despotism, communism, that we would have massacres as great or as evil as any in history, where you and I, in our wisdom and in our innocence, had assumed that those days had gone. But evil is always with us, which is why we have to defend against it. And one of the professors at Hawaii University has pointed out very strongly that when you get a genuine democracy, democracies have never fought democracies. We're too busy trying to increase our standard of living. We have the right moral foundations. And he's done some work on how many people have lost their lives this century. The results are this. In battle, some 36 million people have lost their lives in this century in foreign and domestic wars. 36 million people. Now I'm going to give you a figure, and I'm going to ask you to think about what you expect it to be. How many people have lost their lives because of murder and massacre by totalitarian regimes? The Nazis, the communists, the Stalins. 119 million, of which 95 million under communism. That was the terror against which liberty stood, and won, if I might say so, the fundamental philosophical and democratic battle of the century. My friends, there's still much to be done. There are troubles within our society, many of them, increasing crime, and I'm afraid, increasing social problems, because as we look ahead, some of the most acute problems will be as much within our societies as between them. The values and virtues which we prize are honesty, self-discipline, a sense of responsibility to one's family, of loyalty to one's employer and staff, and a pride in the quality of one's work. All these flourish in a climate of enlightened politics. But these qualities are threatened by a lack of respect for the rights, freedom, and property of others, which manifests itself in rising crime and violence. The truth is, you can't have freedom without order, and order requires both justice under a rule of law and moral and social responsibility. Perhaps the most difficult thing is not only the increase in violent crime, but the increase of children from never married mothers, which is undermining the family. For years, for generations, almost for centuries, the percentage of children born of the total each year who were illegitimate was 5%. It didn't vary during the Great Depression, 5%. Between 1950 and now, that percentage has gone up to 30% in your country and mine. What is more, as we know only too well, these children so often, many of them, do not have a chance. The available data show illegitimate children are much more likely to drop out of school, be poor, use drugs, go on welfare, have emotional problems, experience abuse or neglect, become violent criminals, and tragically, as the circle go round again, bear out-of-wedlock children. Just let me put this point to you. We had hoped, all of us, that as prosperity increased, as we knew more about the values that matter, the combination of the two would mean that we had less evil and more goodness. What we find is we still have to combat the very real evil that exists. And of course, in days gone by, of course we were anxious to do as much as we could to help these children from the non-married mothers. And we did so much that perhaps unwittingly we have increased the number who are born because people artificially bring themselves within the framework of benefit. We've got to have a look at this. If we lose the values, we lose everything. My friends, in spite of all these things, it is a very much better world than it was 10 years ago. The tyrannies of communism have collapsed. Even in China, they're giving economic liberty. There is very much more hope. Never lose faith. Leadership consists of the few who courageously take action to make the impossible happen. That is what this institute has done. At home, we have a program on radio which tries each week to talk about the fundamental values, the truth, the integrity, the loyalty, the family, the justice. And it gives the best poem readings, the best prose readings, the best oratorios, the best music around one of these great virtues. They must have had great difficulty in deciding a title for this program. They couldn't decide a title, so they called it by the name they were calling it as they started to produce the idea. Something understood. It is something between us all that we believe more in the better values, in the biblical beliefs, than in anything else. And we long for them to be put into action. It was Václav Havel, the president of Czechoslovakia, who said, "In everyone there is some longing for humanity's rightful dignity, for moral integrity, and for a sense that transcends the world of existence." He was right. Never lose hope. Never lose faith. Never stop trying. My friends, thank you.
Lady Thatcher, that applause speaks more eloquently than any words I could express about the appreciation of this audience for your remarks and their gratitude for your being here. Lady Thatcher has consented to take questions, make comments for a few minutes. Despite the fact that the hour is late, we're going to do that with her generosity. I would like to ask that those of you with questions come forward and assemble before one or the other of these two microphones. But a couple of requests. Please keep your questions short and to the point. Don't make speeches. We've already had one of those tonight, and you can't compete with that one. And I would also like to ask that you bear in mind a lesson some of us learned this afternoon. We had a group of students from the 4 counties in this area who had won an essay contest come and meet with Lady Thatcher independently for a while this afternoon, and I think they engaged in teenage Florida speak. Or maybe it was Tampa Bay speak, but neither Lady Thatcher nor I could understand all of them very well. So remember, she's a foreigner who doesn't speak the language very well. And so will you please speak slowly and distinctly, and remember that you have to filter the question through me. We'll begin here, please.
Yes, sir. It's certainly a pleasure to have you here, Lady Thatcher. It's very, very great to have you here. Lady Thatcher, I was wondering if you could help me with a phenomena that I've seemed to found in my political activities as a conservative. And the phenomena is this. I've never quite understood how conservatives in this country and in your country will rail against socialism and big government, and then at the same breath, without even changing step, will support the Maastricht Treaty, establishing a European currency, will push for NAFTA and GATT, and push more for the United Nations and big global government run by socialists. I just don't understand this phenomena. Maybe you could help me understand it. Thank you.
Understand that?
Neither do I understand it. I voted against that Maastricht Treaty.
Hear, hear.
It would give up our parliamentary sovereignty, give up our law, override our law. If you give up your currency, you no longer have control of your economy. I do not think the people of Britain want it. I voted against it, will continue to work against it, and hope it never comes about. Now, that's a brief question and a brief answer. Right, next question. Next question.
What
about this? Here we are.
Side, please.
To quote you, never stop trying. I'm the director of Stop Turning Out Prisoners. We have an early release crisis in this country, and I know you've dealt with that as the Prime Minister of Britain. And I wonder what words of wisdom you might give to America on the early release crisis, the release of prisoners early before their prison sentences are served.
Well, that must, if there is parole allowed or release within a certain period of the end of the sentence, in our case it would ultimately be a judgment for the Home Secretary, and therefore it could be questioned in the House. I don't know in your case. There are some cases where I think it's absolutely right that there should virtually be no parole or no remission. But you have to remember the difficulty of the prison governor. If there's no possibility of ever getting out even for a short period, you have to think of what that does to the feeling inside the prison and what side effects it could possibly have. So it's difficult to lay down a general rule, except that most of us believe they should serve most of their sentence. Beyond that, it's in our case the decision of the Home Secretary, the prison governor, on the individual case.
Thank you, Lady.
A question here, please.
I have more of an ethics-related question. Right now, the world is overcoming a computer. We're overwhelmed with information, and right now in this country, there's a bill that has been passed just recently where our freedom of speech has been possibly stomped upon and stifled. right now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with what the Internet and the World Wide Web has been presenting to society, but there are some potentially obscene materials, etc., that are out there. I was wondering how can we as a society balance our amendment rights with the moral fiber that we want to uphold.
Right, now I have 2 points. You're talking about the information, yes. I think T.S. Eliot, partly belonging to you and partly to us, got it right many years ago. Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? So you've got so much information coming to you, it's very difficult to sort it out. Now the second point is this. It was about 3 years ago that I began to talk about internet and began to talk about the dangers of a child in a bedroom with a computer tuning into the most horrific, pornographic or sadistic programs. And we've got to stop it.
But how can we?
You stop it. You stop it. You can usually tell where it is coming from, and you stop it in the usual way by a law against it and very heavy penalties, and you stop it by a chip to block out certain things, and then you'll have to keep ahead of those who are against you. It's one of these awful cases. All scientific inventions can be used for good or evil, and the evil people will get at it if they can. And I have no sympathy with them. You must protect your young generation against this stuff.
Thank you.
Please.
Lady Thatcher, what is your perception of the status of the conservative revolution in the U.S. Congress? Has it stalled or stumbled badly? And if so, what would be your advice to Dole and Gingrich right now?
Well, if I had advice to give, I wouldn't give it publicly, but have quite a lot to say privately.
Please.
Lady Thatcher, another political question. Tony Blair is no longer a liberal. He says his Labour Party is now moderate. I was wondering if you could tell me what that means.
Well, he says he's almost Thatcherite. He's been converted. You could have fooled me because he fought against everything which I did. But let's welcome converts. But my worry is that I think he's possibly in the minority in his views in the Labour Party, and if they were to get back with quite a big majority, I think you'd find that there's quite a lot of socialism still about, because they like larger government, they like increasing taxation, and it is already accepted that if they were to return, the top level of tax, which I got down to 40%, will be up to 50%. That's an enormous increase, and it goes to the heart of the middle classes. And I think what we have to do is to get this point across. He appears to, he's a very nice, good person, and a good Christian, and obviously believes in everything that he is saying. I think there are a lot of people behind him who are much more socialist than they are revealing at the moment, and it's our job to reveal it. And obviously I hope that the kind of revolution which I brought about will continue, and I think it's more likely to continue under a conservative government than converted Thatcherites from the Socialist Party. Thank you.
It's an honor to be able to ask you a question in a country that you are able to ask a question of a person of your stature. Thank you for being here. My question is, what is your view on how to deal with the recent outbreak of IRA violence in your country? And is it true that much of the funding for this violence comes from this country?
It certainly was true in the past. We hope that there have been sufficient warnings issued as what they were up to. Terrorism is the most difficult thing to tackle, because your normal assumptions are that everyone acts legally. If they don't, the police will pick it up, but the police cannot pick up some of the bombers. They can do a good deal, and so can the military, and you can get a certain amount of surveillance. But the terrorist has no moral code or convention whatsoever. Even if you're in wartime, there are certain understandings, there are certain rules which you observe. The terrorist observes none. He is cruel. When we had the truce for the time being, and the IRA said that they would not have any attacks, they nevertheless continued with their violence in Northern Ireland. And if anyone dares to inform, as it is their duty to do, if anyone dares to inform, they will be kneecapped or elbowed or both and tarred and feathered. That is the nature of the people you are dealing with. Now, the people of Northern Ireland voted in 1921 to stay with the United Kingdom. The 6 northern counties were not going to go with the Republic of Ireland. We have a border poll from time to time. They vote still to stay with the United Kingdom. The purpose of the IRA terrorism, and it's not a Republican army, it's a bunch of brigands and murderers. They want, in fact, to terrify people out of voting to stay with Britain. I hope will not succeed in doing. The IRA bombed our Conservative conference in 1984. They killed 5 of my friends, and many were wounded. And they must not win. It's a problem of terrorism all over the world now. There are many terrorist groups, and they are getting hold of the latest advanced weapons which can get out. They can get out of North Korea, they can get out of Russia, and the day we dread is when small nuclear packages get out of Russia. It really is. So we must all continue to fight them together. You can fight an open enemy with the rules of war. It's fighting the terrorist is the most difficult thing. We need information, we need artificial surveillance. We, in fact, we should probably have to strengthen the police forces to deal with this. But order is the most important thing, and people will not go about their daily lives if they fear bombs. There's been another bomb in London by the IRA since I've been here. Fortunately, it killed no one. But please never, never, never support the IRA or any terrorist group. Right.
Thank you.
How are we doing?
All right, we've got quite a number. We're going quite fast, yes.
Please.
What keeps China from embracing democracy, and what's your prognosis for Hong Kong in 1997?
Hong Kong has to return to China in 1997 because most of the land, in fact 93% of the land upon which Hong Kong stands, was on lease from China, not on freehold, and the lease ends in 1997. I negotiated with Deng Xiaoping starting in 1982 about what would happen, and we agreed a treaty which was registered with the United Nations that the capitalist system in Hong Kong, which has done so well for the people of Hong Kong and also for China, should continue for 50 years, and so should our rule of law. Because a communist country has no rule of law, so we needed also to keep it. I think what the Chinese have done in the Taiwan Straits indicates that their ideas of how best to govern and how best to conduct international relations are very different from ours. We shall strenuously maintain that treaty. I believe that although they will not have full democracy for the Legislative Council, I hope they will keep the capitalist and the rule of law, because otherwise they'll be destroying something very valuable for themselves. We, in fact, realizing that there could be trouble, gave something like 250,000 passports for first 50,000 for those who'd done marvelous service for the British government in all kinds of sensitive jobs, each of them bringing 4 people with them. We now have long queues of people who want visas to come. If anything were upset by the activities of the Chinese, then the people of Hong Kong would leave very quickly. And it would depend upon what I might call the Chinese keeping the spirit of that treaty, how things go up to the 30th of June 1997. And I hope they will have the wisdom to understand that they're getting a valuable asset that they could never have built up for themselves. Hong Kong, its prosperity with Chinese people was built up under British administration and a British rule of law. And I hope the Chinese will learn that lesson. Right, thank you.
One more question from each side, please.
Lady Thatcher, you made so much progress under your administration. England made so much progress against socialism. I want to know now how your programs and the progress you made is faring right now in England.
Well, we are, in fact, almost completing the privatization program, which is very good. The thing which is not quite so good is that public expenditure has gone up. I have a theory. Women are much better at holding the purse strings tight than men are. And I held them tight. Mr. Khayyam, yes, women are very much better. I, in my last 4 years, had 4 years of budget surplus. Wouldn't you like me to be president here? That's right. 4 years are back. Now they've gone into big deficits for year after year, and to my horror this year, the cost of servicing our accumulated debt, which is 22 billion, is 1 billion more than we're actually spending on the whole defense program. So I'm all for keeping the purse strings tight. Whoever you are, you have to live within your means, and you shouldn't be ashamed of saying so. Right.
The last question.
Lady Thatcher, I have always believed that America was based on a foundation of law that had an underpinning from God. And I have always believed that the Republican Party, the conservative party in the United States of America, operated on those principles of a moral underpinning which translated into our political and economic lives in America. I am very confused, and I think that I am not alone in being confused that our Republican Party now, our conservative party, calls itself the party of inclusivity and the big tent, meaning that it embraces now a number of liberal, moderate, and conservative principles. Do you see this as a significant change for the Conservative Party in our country, and can our Conservative Party stand strong with this policy of inclusivity?
Well, I don't know about inclusivity. It sounds to me like a new version of the old mixed economy. And I believe that you stand strongly on your principles. There is a tendency on the part of the media to say, oh, they're going right, as if that were a bad thing. Going right means limited government, control of public expenditure, keeping taxation low, and free enterprise, creating the wealth of the nation. You need to go right. And you mustn't take what the media say, that going right is wrong. You need to go right. It is that which has created the great United States. Just let me give you some figures. You have, the question is, how much does a government take of the total wealth created by its people in taxation or for public expenditure? What does it take each year? You and Japan are the lowest. You take about 36, 37% of the whole national wealth annually in taxation. I got ours down to 38%, but it's now up to about 41%. You go to a country like Germany, it's 50%. You go to a country like Denmark, it's 60%. Sweden got up to 70%. So you see, now they're all democracies, and then the people against Sweden rebelled. And eventually, the higher the government take, the more you will find people have less incentive to produce, and so the whole nation suffers. So I don't know about inclusivity, but I do know about limited government, liberty, a rule of law and democracy, and you charge them with that and maintaining that, and you'll be all right.
Thank
Right,
you very
thank you.
much.
feet. He'll roll up